Building visualizations. We're going to talk about three, I'm going to tackle this from three different ways. Like I normally do, I'm going to start with some guidelines, just sort of setting the space a little bit and how to think about this stuff. Then we're going to talk about web versus desktop. I've had a bunch of people in the past that are sort of building web-based tools where the piece of it is visualization, and then I've had a bunch of people in the past where they're building installation-grade artwork, and they sort of want to be able to understand the landscape for how you build something that you can then put somewhere, and functions much more like an installation. Okay? So I'm going to take that framing for it. I'll take a break again at 12 for 5 minutes. So getting into guidelines, the first thing I want to talk about in general approaching is just sketch, sketch, sketch. It's hard to overemphasize how important it is to pick a tool that you can be nimble with, whatever your skill set, because when you're building visualizations of any type, you really need to be able to sketch and iterate super quickly. So if your build cycle or the time it takes you to switch from circles to squares or something is really long, that's going to hurt your ability to do something well. So you need to pick an environment that's super iterative and that you can feel nimble in. So that's the sort of most important guideline. And I think that one of the ways I want to talk about sort of how you want to use this is to remind everyone that visual depictions of information are a super useful debugging tool, right? It's not just about making a pretty picture of your research at the end or producing some interactive visual. There is a lot of sort of skill, or there's a lot of utility to being able to load your data and quickly make a picture of it to understand what it is, and then throw that picture out, or to understand if something's going wrong, right? So if you're building a website and you want to be able to monitor what's going on, the easy thing to do, based on today's technology, is to dump a bunch of the information into a table, right? It is really worth your time making it easy for yourself to be able to dump that same thing into a line chart or a bar chart, because you will benefit greatly from being able to deploy that skill across anything you're doing. And that's super valuable, that approach to thinking about it. Now, you can use a lot of tools to do that, right? So there's amazing tools like Tableau, which is fabulous, their free version. It's super fabulous for letting you take information and make pictures and explore them. But in your tool chain itself, whether you're doing sort of embedded hardware or web stuff, or just sort of research in a notebook, to be able to make pictures quickly of whatever information you have, a sketch is, you don't question a sketch. A sketch looks like a sketch. And a sketch that word carries a certain weight to it. So a sketch means that it's something you can make quickly, that describes the basics of your idea and gives you insight to make some decision afterwards based on doing that sketch. Whether you made a realization while you were making it, or whether you look at the results of that sketch and then come to realize something. That's what a sketch means to me. And that's what I sort of mean when I use that word. You want to be able to sketch super quickly. So the other set of tips is, really don't write anything you don't have to. And I've said this about programming before. There's a lot of institutional baggage in MIT and the Media Lab in general to roll your own everything. And there's a certain joy in that. But that's a total waste of time when it comes to visualization work, right? And you'll see this when I talk about D3 versus other things, right? If you're trying to make a bar chart, just grab a library that does bar charts for you and make a freaking bar chart. And then you can decide whether you need a custom graphic or not, right? Don't go learning D3 to make bar charts. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we start talking about D3 a little bit, which is a language that people use to make visualizations a library people use to make visualizations in JavaScript on the internet. So be smart about trying to ask yourself, is there something that can help me do this right already, right? I've spent weeks building environments when I should have just been doing something in processing, you know? I wanted to make a sketch of some data to understand what was going on with my embedded radio network, and a visual way to do that was the right way to do it because I had too much data to look at otherwise. And I wrote this whole thing, and I should have just been doing it in processing because that would have been way smarter and it would have been way faster. So that's one indicator. So remember that lesson, which is always good to remind yourself. Don't write it unless you have to. I already said spend a lot of time sketching visual stuff. And again, I mentioned we're not sort of approaching the philosophy of how you build software, how to do collaborative design, how to do user-centered design. I've sort of explicitly left that out. just because it's so hard to talk about that in brief and find a way to authentically let you do it without sort of being a sort of an artificial playground. Like, user-centered design needs to be on a project you actually care about. Otherwise, it doesn't, like, you don't learn anything from doing that experience. So I've left that piece out, but particularly with interactive visualizations, it matters who your audience is, and you really need to be able to try stuff out very early to test your assumptions, because visual literacy is quite varied in populations. And this is a topic close to my heart. I do a lot of, as a research scientist in Civic, I do a lot of work on data literacy, visual depictions to sort of do behavior change. I do workshops like weekly and build tools and run classes on this stuff, so I care about this stuff a lot. So I will stop myself from rambling for too long about this stuff, but particularly with visual depictions of information, you need to be very careful about picking something that makes sense to your audience. And your audience could be you. That's totally fine, right? If you're trying to visualize to debug things, then you need to make something that you can understand. If you're trying to visualize to sort of evoke emotion, then you want to test what emotional response you're getting very quickly. Yes, so the question is how much of a generalist you want to be, right? So do you want to build that skill set yourself, or do you want to partner with someone to help build that? And I find that working with graphic designers, you want to make sure you work with someone that has the right sort of visual language for what you're trying to do, right? Because there are many graphic designers that are sort of so invested in flat graphics that they won't think of something interactive, right? And it's not that they have something against it, they just won't think of that as a native way to do it. There's others that just think about touch screens, and you're like, actually, I need a big poster, you know? So if you're working with a graphic or an interaction designer, then just make sure that they have the right, that they don't have blinders on that don't match your blinders, right? It's like, I have a set of blinders on when I'm working on a project. Assumptions I've made that I don't want to change, and because of whatever, like, research reasons. Make sure those match whoever you're partnering with, and be clear about those when you're trying to find someone to work with. So that's what I would say about it. I think, you know, if you're trying to find someone, like, portfolios are the best way to assess anybody, whether it be a coder or a designer. So looking at their portfolio, yeah. Hi, nice to meet you. Can you send me your portfolio, please, before we have dinner together? Portfolios are the best way to assess that, looking at the previous work and what they want to be doing, right? If they say, oh. The last piece here is the approaches, and this is where I've sort of tried to put a little scaffolding on the types of technologies that exist for visualization. So I've made 3 buckets here, and I'm still searching for the right words for these, but I call them configuration, transformation, and rendering. These are sort of 3 different types of tools, and each tool, I would say, falls into one of these types of tools. So what's a configuration tool? Configuration tool is basically where you set up a bunch of metadata. You say, like, oh, I want my bar chart to be blue, I want it to be this tall, here's the data for it, I want it to have these axes, and that's all specified in sort of a configuration format or a file. And then you pass that configuration to the library, and it renders it for you, right? So this is the high charts model, and which I'll get to in a minute if you haven't used that in the previous class. The idea that you set up this massive configuration file and you say, go, right? So that's the configuration type of tool. The transformation tool is much more, I'll probably point at D3 as the primary example of this. The idea that you start with some set of data and you tell it what to do to that data. You say, okay, here's my data. I want you to plot it on an x-axis. I want you to bucket it into 3 different buckets. And I want you to take all the green ones and get rid of them. Right? So you sort of set up a pipeline of operations of what you want to do. So in each of those is a transformation on the data, right? So if you want it on an axis, you're saying, hey, render this on this axis, right? So you're transforming the data to match the axis. You're not saying, hey, here's the axis, go do things, right? So that's the difference between configuration and transformation. Transformation is setting up sort of a pipeline of operations, not saying, hey, here's all the information that you need to render, just go ahead and do it. So that's the second, transformation. Render is really sort of the way I like to think about this type of tool is the idea that you're thinking about what's ending up on the screen first and foremost at a very low level, right? You're saying, okay, put a green box here, put another green box here on top of it, put a white box in between them, okay? Oh, when someone clicks, add 2 black boxes on top. right? So you're telling it what to draw at a very low level. And you're saying, okay, and then whenever new data comes in, get rid of all of that and rebuild it, right? So you're saying things like that. You're sort of really telling it exactly what you want to be drawing on the screen. So it doesn't work at sort of the metadata level, and you're not really setting up the pipeline. You're much more responding to stuff. So those are 3 buckets that I'm still working on the right names for, but I think they'll be helpful as I talk about the examples of which tool falls into each bucket. It'll be helpful to think about what the differences are here. So configuration, and the things you've already tried, configurations is high charts, transformation is D3, and rendering is open frameworks in the way that I'm defining it. Okay? So that's the sort of lay of the land for how I think about the space.